All right. Hello. Just in case you weren't sick of Zoom yet, I think the easiest way for me to record this is Zoom. Sorry about the background light. It is pretty late on a Tuesday. So this is continuation of our first lecture. So you want to continue in on the notes. At the end, I'll talk to you a little bit about our plan for Thursday, just to make sure everybody is on the same page. So the previous slide that we were working with was about torture. And so we had the potro, we had the toca, and we had the groucho. These torture devices were not used very often. In fact, only about 10% of all prisoners of the Inquisition were tortured, and their confessions had to be restated again after the torture ended. In fact, there were even rules about how often you could torture somebody, but the Inquisition figured out a rule that the United States Senate regularly uses. They would never stop the torture, they would just pause the torture, meaning that they could continue it at a later date and still not violate the rules. The next big subject that we didn't have time for was the auto de fe. This word's going to show up quite a bit, and it's a really, really important one. The illustration here is going to be by a Spanish artist. The Inquisition regularly hired artists, not so much as propaganda, but it functioned as propaganda. But they attempted to do it in as well of a light or truthful light as they could. So you have these court proceedings, you've got these scaffolds that are built up ahead of time. You then have prisoners down here. You've got some people wearing what are called San Benitos, which are a type of punishment. And you will eventually have public executions at these things. They operate with a huge amount of pomp and circumstance. 30 days beforehand, there are public declarations read at every single mass and throughout the town that there's going to be an auto de fe. They then arrive a few weeks beforehand and they start building up the scaffolding. They start creating where the mass is going to be held. This was a moment for the ages. It was something that you had to go to. It was something that the king and queen did. But they were not regular occurrences. In fact, they were incredibly irregular, and it was likely that a lot of Spaniards never saw one in their life. They didn't necessarily happen at a certain time. They didn't necessarily happen at a certain city, and it was not the only way to punish people. And so it was kind of a big, huge grace where an edict of grace would be read, then a lot of heretics would be found, and then they would organize these auto de fes. They lasted from about 4 a.m. till 4 in the afternoon, but they were also able to move up to 700 different people through the process, so they were relatively quick and efficient. Most of them were not going to burn, but those happened at the very end of it. You were able to make a last-minute conversion. That was entirely possible. However, they were very suspect of anybody who on the way to the gallows or on the way to the burning suddenly found Jesus and wanted to confess to all of their crimes. If they did confess, they were ushered through a back door to then be interrogated, not tortured, but questioned about the validity of their conversion and not just that they were afraid to die. The big ending, which was not the only punishment by any means, was burning at the stake. As long as you had confessed and you publicly confessed, they would garrote you, which is probably not pronounced correctly, and the subtitles definitely did not say it correctly. But they would garrote you, which would be a chain around your neck, which somebody far from the flames would pull. That would strangle you and suffocate you as the fire was set. That way you weren't actually burning alive. Somebody who would not recant, would not confess, who would not publicly admit guilt of what had already been sentenced, they would not get that same treatment. And there's also some stories of where the chain failed, it got too hot, people dropped it. Those fires would sometimes go on for multiple hours with people screaming in agony, which when you're looking for a nice religious ceremony that has a mass, it has a breakfast, it has lunch, is not exactly the type of thing the Spanish Inquisition was going to. So these things were called the auto de fe. It was the big showcase event. It's what makes it into the propaganda. It's what the artistry is about, the paintings, etc. And it was must-see TV at the time, including for the kings and queens of Spain. But it wasn't the only punishment. I mentioned the term San Benita. That is depicted in this image. If you are ordered to wear a San Benita, it was the only outfit you were ever allowed to wear in public, ever, for the rest of your life. Anytime you went out, you had to dress as this, which showcases the devil and your aspect of a sinner. If you were burned at the stake in an auto de fe, they took a San Benita, put your family name on it, and then ordered it to be hung for the rest of time inside your local church, trying to shame all of the family and the survivors and remind people that there was a heretic with that last name. It was an incredibly painful punishment to one's pride. So burning at the stake was not preferred, but obviously that got the point across that you were not to do certain things that would get you into the label of a Judaizer or a Morisco who was still practicing Islamic traits, or a Protestant or a witch. But when you're going through 700 different people in an auto de fe, the vast majority of them are not getting burned at the stake because less than 2,000 people were probably killed by the Spanish Inquisition over the course of more years than the entire history of the United States of America. So what were the other punishments? You could pay a fine, which was restitution. That's within our criminal justice system. Relatively normal aspect. You're going to pay, goes to the church, goes to the Inquisition, goes to the crown. You could have a public flogging, and these are Game of Thrones style, where you are stripped down virtually naked. You are then marched through the street, and at the end, you are going to be whipped. You could be whipped up to 200 times, but once again, they had doctors on staff. They were not trying to kill you. They were trying to make a point, but obviously that is still going to be incredibly painful and embarrassing, as well as people on the street spitting at you, shaming you, yelling at you, those types of things. You could be sentenced to prison time. Just like before, this is at your own expense. So if you want a really, really nice jail and prison, you can, and you can go bankrupt doing it. They provide you your slippers. However, the rest of it, including if you want your butler, is going to be at your expense. So they can sentence you to jail and then continue to milk money from you. The least preferred of all punishments, even to the idea of burning at the stake for some people, was you could be sentenced as a gallery slave. Galleries are types of boats. The Spanish had a big seafaring nation during this. After all, Christopher Columbus sailed for Spain at the beginning of the expulsion here. They typically use slaves as the rowers on their boat, and you could be sentenced for up to 5 years. This was an incredibly dangerous job. It was deadly. It was very, very difficult and painful, disease-ridden, drownings, abuse. So it was not a punishment that people did lightly. It was also a punishment that the civil courts of Spain also gave, and it's where Spain got most of their slaves, as they didn't really participate as much in the African slave trade as the other European nations. And then we talked about the San Benita, which is this outfit that you publicly had to wear in order to bring shame or ridicule to your family, and one was hung up in your local parish with your name on it. As the Spanish Inquisition was set up, it was set up with 3 very, very specific flaws that I want you to write down. The first is that they had no source of their own funding. This led to a lot of accusations that the Spanish Inquisition was only burning rich people and not poor people. They were confiscating money to pay for prison, and to pay for them because they had to pay their prison guards, they had to pay for the building, they had to rent out things. Eventually, at one point, they start taking property from people and then renting it out as a Airbnb type situation in order to pay for themselves. About 150 years into the Spanish Inquisition, the crown finally relented and ordered churches to give a portion of their tithing to the Inquisition. And that gave a little bit of steady funding to them. But every single year, besides the first couple of years where they went after Jewish converts, the Spanish Inquisition ran a deficit, meaning that they spent more money than they brought in. This always led to accusations that they were doing it for the money rather than for the religious purpose. There's not actually good evidence for that in any way, shape, or form. The crown was entitled to 1/3 of all monies that the Spanish Inquisition took, which then led to ideas that the Spanish crown was just trying to rob and frame their people. But the Spanish crown, starting with Isabella and Ferdinand, oftentimes gave back that 1/3 of property to keep the Inquisition going. So the first of three flaws is that the Inquisition had no stable source of funding, which led them to massive accusations of bribery, of doing it for the money, etc. Second of all, they kept the traditions that they were hunting alive. So they would arrive for the Edict of Grace, gather all the townspeople and say, you need to confess any Jewish traits or traditions or cultural rites that you're doing. And people would be silent. And then finally, one Spaniard would raise their hand and they would say, what are Jewish traits and culture? And the Inquisition would be like, things you shouldn't do. And the guy's like, well, how do I know I did them in order to confess to you if I don't know what they are? And the Spanish Inquisition was like, yeah, that's kind of a good point. So it's things like not eating pork. It's things like facing the wall to the west when you die. It's going to be doing this on the Sabbath day and not doing this. And it's going to be about birthrights that happen in. And they're like, oh, okay. That's what Jewish people do. And so as the Spanish Inquisition came into towns, they would post these lists of things that you could not do, which occasionally give ideas of people of, oh, well, maybe I should do that. That sounds interesting. And so the second flaw of the Spanish Inquisition is after the initial hunt happens, it was the Spanish Inquisition that kept the stories and kept the ideas and kept the traditions alive by educating the populace on what they were hunting. And they did this with the Protestants, they did it with the Muslim converts, and they did it with witches. The third of three flaws, however, was that it was too secretive. If you were a prisoner of the Spanish Inquisition, you were not allowed to say anything. Not what happened, not where you went, not how they did it, nothing about who. This happens a lot of times in lawsuits. For example, Chesterton High School is oftentimes sued. And when we are sued, the person suing us will talk to the newspaper and they will say, I am suing because Chesterton did this, 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 or failed to do this, 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 and we look terrible. The paper, attempting to be fair, will then go to the high school and they will comment, ask for a comment, and the comment is, we refuse to comment. So you have a list of bad, 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 bad. We're not going to say anything. That's because our lawyers do things through the school. We don't get into a PR battle, which is only going to look bad for us. We don't want to violate or cross any lines or turn people against us by defending ourselves. We're only going to defend ourselves in the actual court, not the court of public opinion. So that makes us in those lawsuits look really bad because you only ever hear one side of it. When Protestantism happens, Protestantism and Catholicism spawn a series of European wars after Luther breaks away from the Catholic Church. We are talking about wars across Germany. We are talking about wars in France. We are talking about wars in England. And Spain becomes the center of the Catholic world. So the Protestants wanted to propagate the ideas that Catholic Spain was bad. And this was the perfect opportunity for them. You have a group that wears red, that tortures people, that burns them at the stake, potentially stealing their money and maybe doing it for the money. And no matter what I say about them, their PR response will be no comment. We neither say it happened, nor do we say it did not happen, and they just let the mystery go there. Now, the mystery can help them in some fashions. If you think that the inquisitors are demonic torturers who are going to do the worst torture in the history of mankind and have no ability to stop, when they take you in, you're going to be absolutely terrified and want to confess every single thing you ever possibly did. So there were some advantages to doing this, but the flaw was that they were too secretive, which made them lose in the court of public opinion. So we got just a couple more here. So we've talked about there are 4 phases to the Spanish Inquisition. Phase 1 is about the Jewish converts called the conversos. The second phase is going to be against Protestants. The third phase is going to be against Muslim converts to Christianity, what are called Moriscos. And the fourth one are going to be our witches. So phase 1 either is the new Christians, the conversos, or Jewish converts. Ultimately, they're easy targets. So in 1492, an expulsion order comes out, and everybody that is Jewish needs to leave. Anybody that stays has to convert. Some people tried to run away, but got brought back because the ships crashed, shipwrecked, didn't have enough money, those types of things. And the Jewish people did not make it easy on them. There's a lot reminiscent here, even though it happened first, to what happened to the Jewish people under Hitler's Germany, where they started making laws that made it very, very difficult. So on one hand, they said all Jewish people that want to stay Jewish, get out. But on the other hand, they said, you can't carry any gold or silver with you. That can't leave our shores. So now if I'm Jewish and I'm being forced to move, I have to sell everything because you can't exactly hire an ocean tanker to take all your stuff. So I got to sell my house. I've got to sell most of my possessions because I'm going to have to walk out of here with only what I can carry essentially in the 1400s, early 1500s at this point in time. However, every single person in the country knows I'm Jewish. They know I have to sell by a certain date, and they know that I cannot take any gold or silver with me. This led to some insane trades, including one story where somebody sold a house for a donkey. One singular donkey is all that they got for a house in Spain. Jewish people became easy targets if they stayed. The new conversos, or the new Christians that were Jews, had ethnic and cultural traits. One of the fascinating things about Judaism versus other religions, it is both a religion and it's an ethnic group, meaning that I can be born to a Jewish family and identify as Jewish without having any religious belief whatsoever. Likewise, I could be born to a non-Jewish family with non-Jewish genetics, DNA, etc., cultural traits, those types of things, and I can convert to the religion and become Jewish in that way. That word fits into both of those elements. Judaism has its own unique ethnic and cultural traits that aren't necessarily of the religion. And so even when they converted to Christianity, they oftentimes did not change their celebrations, their ways of speaking, their habits of doing things, which were all cultural and ethnic traits, not religious traits. They were also targeted for reprisal and extortion. Remember, all somebody has to do in the Edict of Grace is accuse somebody of something. It stays anonymous, and there's no penalty for you making an accusation. So anybody who had an enemy, it was very easy to go up in the Edict of Grace and call out so-and-so who you didn't like. In places where Jewish people were able to stay or allowed to visit, oftentimes the Jewish people who disliked the converts in there would be the ones who would turn in them as traitors to their ethnic group, to their culture, to their religion. They were also targeted for past mistakes. There was no statute of limitations on this type of stuff. There are stories where somebody's only crime that they were sent to the stake for was something that they did not confess that they had done 20 years earlier. And so, because they had previously been Jewish, they oftentimes had done Jewish things while they were Jewish, and they were targeted for these past mistakes that they had made. They're also targeted for minor errors or momentary lapses. Again, the rule of thumb is, at the Edict of Grace, confess everything. If you forget something, but somebody else says 7 years ago, you honored the Sabbath in the wrong way, and you refused to eat the pork when you came over to my dinner party, if you forget that, you have now committed a crime. Between 1488 and 1505, at the very, very beginning of this, during the expulsion and right after the immediacy of the conversion and the forced conversions, 1,191 out of 1,199, so all but 8 arrested in Catalonia, which is one of the biggest provinces of Spain, were new Christian, former Jew conversos. That's the group that they targeted. That's the group that they went after. That's the group that they focused on the very, very beginning. And to an extent, in an evil way, they had success, but not perfect success. While they did successfully push down Jewish cultural traits and put them behind the scenes and more secretive nature, they failed to actually improve the nation's understanding of Christianity. Religious illiteracy in this country was incredibly low, meaning that you ask these people who went to church and claimed to be Catholic any details about the Catholic faith, and they knew virtually nothing, especially out in the countryside. And most areas never actually got to see an inquisitor during one's lifetime. And so you didn't run face to face with the Inquisition very often. They weren't hovering over you like a shadow constantly. And so, for the most part, people never interacted, never feared, never thought about this. By 1532, anyone punishing for Judaizing, which was the idea of a converso doing something Jewish, at the age of 50 would have been 10 years old at the time of the expulsion in 1492. That means after one generation, they basically pushed this down and defeated the purpose that they were set up for. They weren't needed anymore, which set up the need for phase 2, which was the Protestants. It was by 1540 that the conversos began to disappear from Inquisition trials, which means either they had succeeded in eliminating the Jewish culture / traits from the conversos, or they had turned their focus to something else and began ignoring it. The evidence suggests more likely the first one, that they actually succeeded in driving the Jewish people out of Spain and driving the Jewish cultural traits out of the conversos. For our class, we are planning in this remote learning to meet as a class, just remote teaching, and change very, very little. There are some good things built in. For all of these units that we're doing during this time period, I spent a lot of time with podcasts and other lessons. There are going to be some things that we have to adapt, but if you are absent from one of these things, A, I will mark you absent. B, the podcast is an excellent way to get the same lecture, in fact, probably even more in depth with less grammatical errors. It's a better way of understanding things. And so if you're absent, always look for that podcast in there. But we're going to continue to lecture. We're going to continue to take notes. We're going to continue to talk and discuss as a class. On Thursday, we're going to ease into this new process. We're just going to finish the trivia night. How I get you guys your prizes, we will figure that out, because it would have been significantly better if we had finished the first day, but I really, 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 really felt the necessity to quiz you on Lowry trivia, so make sure you are studying up before Thursday. If you have any questions, concerns, worries, challenges, problems, or good TV recommendations for me, don't hesitate to contact me. Bye, guys.